Frankly, what I see in him is a person who feels diminished because he has lost his roots. From this arises his insecurity. Every person on earth does not like to lose his or her roots. It's just human nature. I don't know how we managed to segue into losing roots when the video that I made a couple of weeks ago was quite palpably on the bad behavioral patterns of the Malaysian Chinese community, like hooliganism, gangsterism, discrimination against Indians, calling Indians Apu Nene, calling Peranakans bananas, and of course denying rental property to Indians, and of course, like in most circumstances, 10 out of 10 landlords happen to be Malaysian Chinese, right? So I don't know how we managed to segue from me calling out bad behavioral patterns in the Malaysian Chinese community to this idiot suddenly talking about me losing roots, as if Peranakans lost their roots, as if Peranakans are simply Chinese who forgot how to be Chinese. But I can't blame this Chinese fool for thinking that Baba Nyonya people who are culturally Peranakan are simply underperforming Chinese, because throughout the 19th and early 20th century there were numerous people from the English-educated Cinque merchant classes who ended up adopting the title of Baba or Nyonya without any connection to the title. And what this video is going to talk about is basically how these wolves in Baba clothing, people like Lim Boon Keng and Kuan Yew, framed the Peranakan identity not as a complete and rooted Nusantaran Creole culture, but merely as a shallow, rootless, and incomplete form of diaspora Chinese identity, which needed to be fixed. And you will see individuals like Lim Boon Keng and Kuan Yew, these counterfeit Babas who adopted the title without any rootedness to the title, claiming to be Peranakan, but at the same time insisting that the Babas must go back to their roots. So in today's video, we're going to talk about the counterfeit Peranakans of the Straits and how they muddied the waters and confused everyone. You see this picture? This picture was taken in the 1950s. This is my late grandmother, Madam Ruby Go. It's not a very clear picture, but this is her when she was much younger. This is a baju kabaya. Anyway, this picture says 1,000 words. A Nyonya lady sitting comfortably in a sea of Malay faces. Trust that has been built over centuries that cannot be bought and cannot be faked by any pitiful imposters pretending to be one of us. Because this is the historical inheritance that was built over generations, that began when one brave Chinese sailorman decided to leave China and start a life anew on the soil of Nusantara. I'll show you a few other pictures. Oh, let me show you some others. Oh yes, see this picture over here? Beautiful picture, isn't it? This is my great-great-great-grandmother. She was a true blue Nyonya. And this picture was taken long before Lee Kuan Yew was sucking his thumb, yeah? This one here was taken even before Lee Kuan Yew's father was sucking his thumb. This is my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, I believe. And one of these boys is my great-great-great-great-grandfather. I've been here for a very, very bloody long time. And I don't think I need outsiders telling me what I am or what I should be. My grandmother did not speak Chinese or read the language. And she did not need to, because she was happily rooted in Southeast Asia, and she was not some insecure diasporoid who went around telling people to get back in touch with their roots. She knew who she was, and I know who I am. And I don't need outsiders
telling me who I am and trying to define what a Peranakan should be. She was an English teacher who taught generations of Malaysians how to read and write in English. Do you know what some of the vile pieces of shit called her? They called her a banana. They called her a running dog. A Nyonya lady who did not speak Mandarin or read Chinese, but was far more useful than your Chinese heroes like Kuan Yew, was called a banana and a running dog because she did not fit the metrics of the rabid degenerates of the Chinese diaspora. My grandmother did not need to measure to your Chinese yardsticks, and neither do I, frankly.
Anak Cina menjual lada, timbang mari berkati-kati. Kalau ada salah sepatah, jangan taruh di dalam hati. This is a poem by the Baba poet Xiao Heiyang that was written in 1926, and it is one of the dozens of poems that you will find in Ding Chu Meng's amazing book, Pantun Peranakan Baba, which means the Peranakan Baba's poems, that was written as part of an initiative in order to preserve the valuable and priceless heritage of our Baba Nyonya community. It's such a pity, though, that for many of our cousins across the causeway, they won't understand a single word of this beautiful poem, which talks about forgiving small mistakes and looking at the big picture. Yes, our cousins across the causeway in Singapore, through no fault of their own, will be unable, many of them, to understand a single word in this book, which was written in Malay. But it is a beautiful and invaluable tool in accessing the Peranakan culture. And whose fault might that be? Well, it is indeed not their fault, but rather the fault of some Chinese fellow by the name of Harry Lee Kuan Yew, who decided, for some strange, bizarre reason, that the descendants of people who were pantuning in Malay, who considered Malay the language of their heart, should be learning Mandarin as their mother tongue. Yes, in one generation, the soul of the Baba Nyonya community was snuffed out by some Mandarin technocrat who arrived late to the party. I may have his accent, but I certainly do not have his values. Now, don't get me wrong, the superficial trappings of the culture still exist in Singapore, such as the kebaya, the sarongs, the food, the porcelain, and the antiques. Yes, they do. However, for many Singaporean Peranakans, and this is a very uncomfortable truth that I have to mention, that many will not like to hear, the soul of the Peranakan culture does not exist anymore. And I'm not talking about merely linguistic loss, but rather a spiritual loss, a loss of spiritual inheritance. Because if you ask people in Singapore, many people in Singapore will tell you that the majority of Babas and Nyonyas in Singapore identify themselves as part of the broader Chinese diaspora and do not associate themselves with the Malay world as much as they do with the Chinese world. And that is what I mean by the loss of the soul of the culture. You have the body, no doubt, but the soul is gone. Because it was not China that birthed the Peranakan culture, it was not China that birthed the Baba Nyonya culture, it was not India that birthed the Chetty culture of Malacca, it was the very soil of this land, Nusantara, that birthed our culture. But when you reduce yourself to just another subset of the Chinese diaspora and you distance yourself from the kampong roots of your culture, and this sarong is
a symbol of our kampong roots. It's my grandfather's sarong, my late grandfather's sarong. You have essentially traded in hundreds of years of rootedness for profit and respectability. Because let's be clear, these Peranakans, these modern Peranakans, whether they be in Singapore or even in Malaysia, who try to disassociate themselves from the Malay world, still want market share of the Babas and Nyonyas culture. But they treat our culture as merely a museum antique to be curated, rather than an actual living, breathing, organically developed Creole culture that is a distinct fusion of Chinese and Malay elements that did not have Mandarin forced down its throat, because the language that comes all the way from Beijing has no relevance with our culture. Not apologizing for that, I'm not belittling your language, but I'm saying that language is not neutral. If a Peranakan learns Malay first, followed by Chinese, that is fine. But if they learn Chinese instead of Malay, as it happened to many Peranakans in Singapore, they end up absorbing the Chinese worldview. Because language is not simply neutral. When you learn Chinese, you also learn the not just the mechanics of the language, but you also learn the cultural ethos of the language. You learn about the importance of hierarchy, the importance of absolute filial piety, of unconditional loyalty even to abusive family structures. Why, and before long, you forget that the root of your culture is in the Malay world, not in the Chinese world. And that is what I mean by the soul of the Peranakan culture is gone for many people. Only the body remains. This is where we get to the touchy topic, and this will ruffle a lot of Singaporean feathers. Never mind, I'm Malaysian, I'm a Malaysian Baba, so it doesn't really matter whose feathers in Singapore I ruffle. If I ruffle the Malaysian Chinese diaspora's feathers, that's fine as well, because, you know, having held my tongue for the past 3 decades, over 3 decades, I'm 35 this year, and being polite has not proven to be effective in getting my point across. So no more sugarcoating, no more pulling punches. Let me get something very straight. There are many people in Singapore and even in Malaysia who erroneously call Kuan Yew a Baba. In Singapore, he's listed as one of the 50 greatest Babas. And, well, in Malaysia, there are many people from the Chinese diaspora who say, oh, Kuan Yew was Baba too. As if, you know, Kuan Yew, who erased the Baba's ancestral tongue off their tongues, is some yardstick that we should emulate. Kuan Yew, who had a brittle and often tense and hostile relationship with our Malay cousins, is now being lauded as a model Baba, when in fact the Babas and Nyonyas developed organically in the Malay world, and we literally watched over each other's children for hundreds of years. Suddenly this late arrival fella, whose great-grandfather showed up in the 1860s, ends up being called a 4th generation Hakka Peranakan. If you go by Kuan Yew's wife's words, Kuan Yew, his wife said that, I quote, Kuan Yew and I both come from Peranakan families. We did not speak any Chinese in the house. But if you dig a bit deeper, her husband's Baba claim is actually quite sketchy, in the same way that Lim Boon Keng's Baba claim is also quite sketchy. Now we need to be very clear about something. To be Baba is more than just being able to converse in beautiful Queen's English and to speak beautiful Malay. Make no mistake, Lee Kuan Yew's Malay was beautiful. It was melodious, poetic, but he did not regard it as the language of his heart. He regarded it as a political tool to win over the Malay masses, like wearing a songkok to the kampong, okay? But he considered himself distinct from the Malay world. Yes, I'm aware that he spoke Baba Malay, because in his autobiography it says so. But speaking Baba Malay doesn't make you Peranakan either. Because by the logic of you being culturally so-and-so because you speak a certain language, well, Hugh Clifford may as well be culturally Malay because he spoke beautiful Malay. And Sapenza may as well be culturally Chinese because he speaks beautiful Mandarin, right? Look, Lee Kuan Yew himself stated that there were distinct differences between Malay and Chinese people, and that Malays and Chinese simply come from a different civilizational rhythm. I'll show you the quote.
There are deep and abiding differences between groups, and whatever we do, we must remember that in Singapore, the Malays feel they are being asked to compete unfairly, that they are not ready for the competition against the Chinese and the Indians and the Eurasians. They will not admit, or they cannot admit to themselves, in fact, as a result of history, they are a different gene pool, and they do not have these qualities that can enable them to enter the same race. I'm not here to bitch about political correctness, but what kind of Baba is this? An Ali Baba? A real Baba, a true Baba, would consider the Malays his orang jati, his cousins. Who talks about his cousins like that?
So how can a man who disdains the Malay world, who considers the Malay world to be backward, the Malay world that birthed the Baba and Nyonya culture to be backward, regressive, and unproductive, how can this man who dismisses the Malay world as the land of sunshine and coconuts which produces soft and lazy people, how can this man call himself a representative of a culture that was born in this very Malay world? It's ludicrous. That way, Sapenza might as well call himself a representative of the Chinese culture, right? Or some Afrikaan fellow who's been living in South Africa for 4 generations may as well be calling himself a representative of the South African culture. Now, was Lee Kuan Yew Peranakan? Perhaps a quarter on his grandmother's side, right? But let's look at the Hakka part of the family. See, on Wikipedia, it states that Lee Kuan Yew is a Hakka Peranakan. Now, according to the strict and ultra-pedantic gatekeepers of the Straits settlements, you need to have at least one Hokkien parent in order to count yourself as a Baba, or at least a Teochew parent. But let's not split hairs. I really hate all this dog kennel club obsession about genealogy. Let's look at just how rooted the Lee family really was in Nusantara. Okay, let's see. Lee Kuan Yew's great-grandfather came from Guangdong province, a Hakka gentleman by the name of Lee Bok Bun. And after a while he fucked back to China. What kind of Baba is this? An Ali Baba? This man literally came after, 7 years after Yap Aloy showed up in Malacca. And yes, Yap Aloy, the Hakka tin miner who turned into a warlord merchant, left Malacca and he went to Kuala Lumpur to make his fortune. At the very least, Yap Aloy stayed. He stayed. So technically he was actually more Baba than Lee Kuan Yew's great-grandfather. Now Lee Kuan Yew himself describes himself as technically a Baba, but not spiritually one or culturally one. Well, I hate to break it to the historical revisionists who want to call Lee Kuan Yew a Baba, but Lee Kuan Yew was at least honest enough to say that he was not Baba in any meaningful sense, because he wasn't. But to be honest, I don't think he was even technically a Baba. Because to be a Baba, you actually need to have a rooted sense of being Nusantara. Your North Star cannot be China. You can learn the Chinese language as a foreign language, but you must regard it as a foreign language to your culture, not some essential component of your culture that you cannot do without. Because Lee Kuan Yew would often talk about how before he learned Chinese in his 30s, he felt that he was missing something important.
I see a person who gets deculturalized, and I nearly was, so I know the danger. He loses his self-confidence. You feel a sense of deprivation. For optimum performance, a man must know himself, know the world. He must know where he stands. Oh yes, of course, Harry, I know where I stand, and I stand in the Nusantaran world, and Malay is the language of my heart. I may speak the English language better than I speak the Chinese language because I learned English early in life. Good for you, but as a Baba, I don't see how the Chinese language is relevant to my identity. But I'll never be an Englishman in 1,000 generations. Yeah, that's the thing. I don't plan to be an Englishman either, you see. But, you see, I don't fall into that false binary of English educated versus Chinese educated, because we have a whole different identity that doesn't depend on Beijing's validation. And I have not got the Western value system inside me. It's an Eastern value system, with the Western value system superimposed.
But real Babas, actual Babas like Tan Cheng Lock, or myself, or my grandfather, or my grandmother, did not care about knowing Mandarin, because Mandarin was superfluous to their identity. If you feel a gravitational pull towards China, and you feel a gravitational pull towards the Chinese identity, and you feel incomplete without the Chinese identity, and you think that other people who happen to have Chinese ancestry are incomplete without it, I'm sorry, but you're not spiritually a Baba. You're not spiritually Peranakan. You are born on this soil, but not off this soil. You are an anxious diaspora man, trying to prove that you're Chinese enough, okay? But how did we get to this conundrum? Like, I asked my Singaporean friend, who's Baba, by the way, was Lee Kuan Yew Baba? You know, a lot of people talk about him being a Baba. And my friend told me, he was a Sinke who spoke English, right? And the fact of the matter is that many wealthy merchant families who'd arrived just 1 or 2 generations ago, like Lee Kuan Yew, the 4th generation Hakka Peranakan, ended up claiming the title of Baba and Nyonya because it was considered a prestigious title in colonial times, right? Because the Babas basically had the ear of the Malay community as well as the British resident. So it made sense for many of these imposters who just arrived maybe 1 or 2 generations ago to suddenly claim they were Peranakan because they were born on this soil, right? But they were not born off it because their mind, their soul was still in China. And well, the thing is that Straits Chinese, I have to make it very clear that a Straits Chinese and a Baba are 2 very separate things. And these categories would often get conflated in colonial times. Yes, all of you Malaysian Chinese who are non-Peranakans are technically Straits Chinese because you were born in Nusantara, right? And presumably you don't consider yourself to be a Chinese of China, so you are technically a Straits-born Chinese. However, that does not make you a Baba, okay? Just because you may put on a kabaya every now and then, just because you may enjoy Peranakan food every now and then, just because someone in your family cooked Peranakan food, that does not make you Baba. But sadly, this confusion exists, and that is why people who do not accurately represent the Peranakan condition ended up speaking on our behalf. And that is how Malay was scrubbed from the Singaporean Peranakan's tongue, and the Singaporean Peranakan's brains were recalibrated to think of themselves as just another branch of Chinese, rather than being, culturally and spiritually Nusantara. And basically that's how the rift between the Singapore Baba and the Kampong took root, because the confusion occurred when Lee Kuan Yew, who was supposed to be an authentic Baba voice, ended up defining what really was and wasn't Peranakan. Now, I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from the introduction to Lim Boon Keng's essays. And I'm going to show you why the author and why the translator of this book, cannot be said to be an accurate representation or an accurate representative of the culture. Now, just because you are non-Peranakan, it doesn't mean you can't talk about our culture. Ding Chu Meng, for example, the one who wrote Pantun Peranakan Baba, is a good representative of the Peranakan culture. He's never claimed to be Baba, but I trust him. However, not every person who represents our culture is doing it in the correct way. Let me show you what I mean.
As an overseas Chinese born in Singapore, Dr. Lim Boon Keng had served as president of Amoy University for more than 16 years. Why is a so-called Baba man serving as the president of a Chinese university? Why is he not serving a Malayan institution? Why does he root himself in China and claim to be Baba? Fishy. Dr. Lim devoted himself to study and propagandize Confucianism all his life. Hadn't really cut ties with the motherland, had he? The so-called China motherland. It can be said that Dr. Lim made important contributions to develop and propagate Confucianism. However, we can't find the name of Dr. Lim in the history of Chinese philosophy or the history of Confucianism. Dr. Lim's name was unknown, just like a long-vanished legend. It was indeed very regrettable. As early as 100 years ago, there had been a movement named Re-Sinicization of the Peranakan community in Singapore and Malaya. Dr. Lim Boon Keng was the most representative figure of this movement, except that none of us asked for it. What triggered such a movement was a serious inclination towards westernization and Malayanization in the Baba society at the time. Now, this is a serious mistake, because the Malay world is our cultural base, you dungu. In order to bring back those Babas who gradually deviated from traditional Chinese culture to the arms of Chinese culture, we didn't deviate, we formed new roots. Dr. Lim led a group of scholars in launching a series of campaigns including culture, education, and social reform movements in Singapore and Malaya at the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century. Though these campaigns were mainly focused on the Babas and Nyonyas community society, they gradually expanded into the Singke community and brought greater social impact to the history of Singapore.
Okay, first mistake there, Re-Sinicization. The use of re in Re-Sinicization. The prefix we is already incorrect, because the Babas and Nyonyas are not have never been and never will be part of your cynic tree, first of all. Yes, our ancestor might have cut ties with China and married into the soil. And yes, our ancestor patrilineally was Chinese. But that does not make his descendants part of the cynic tree any more than it makes the descendants of Shufu in Japan part of the cynic tree either, okay? We are not your banana cousins, first of all. This re-Sinicization, so to speak, was as a result of people like Lim Boon Keng, and I'll talk about him in a bit more, whose grandfather literally got off a boat 2 generations ago. Yes, Lim Boon Keng was himself the grandson of a Sinke who married a Straits-born woman, and it's unclear whether she was a Nyonya or not. And suddenly he ended up calling himself Peranakan because he happened to be born here, and he happened to like certain aspects of the Peranakan culture, like sambal and the baju kebaya, which he made his sisters wear. But that doesn't make him Peranakan. It makes him the grandson of a Sinke who happened to absorb certain elements of the Babas and Nyonyas culture. Yes, back then, you see, the gatekeeping wasn't as tight, you see, so Lim was able to slip through the cracks. So, but you can see that this is a man who was still orbiting the Chinese world. For many years, Babas and Nyonyas ate with their right hand. They wore sarongs. And yet, for some reason, this Chinaman named Lim Boon Keng gets to lecture and moralize to the Babas that we are rootless. We have lost our roots. No, Mr. Lim, we did not lose our roots. We created new ones in Nusantara. It's just roots that you don't see, roots that you don't understand, because you do not understand Nusantara.
Dr. Lim's main purpose in writing these articles was to introduce and infuse Confucian culture into those Babas who received English education in order to get them to come back to the Confucian tradition again, as well as to introduce it to the Westerners. Dr. Lim himself did not directly bring out the situation of Babas at the time. However, Professor Wolfgang Frank, a famous sinologist who came from Germany and was appointed a visiting professor in the University of Malaya for a long time, gave an insightful footnote to this problem. The biggest shortcoming of Chinese people only receiving English education was that Chinese traditional culture was uprooted. Oh yeah, you ignored hundreds of years of pantuns and shires, right? And Dondang Sayang and all the Malay stuff. Oh yeah, I guess you fucking sinologists are not interested in that. Even if they received more than 13 years of English education, the education was still superficial. Only a handful of excellent students could thoroughly grasp the basic values of the Western culture so as to replace their long-lost Chinese culture. And more unfortunately, most Chinese people were satisfied with their superficial English education because of job security, which would lead to a comfortable life. Again, Peranakans are not simply Chinese people who forgot how to speak Chinese. You don't even understand a bloody thing about Peranakans. Some of them might even become professionals, white collars. Hence, not only were they proud of their English education, on the contrary, they despised those people who were Chinese educated. Yeah, I despise Chinese chauvinists and Chinese ultras who try to lump me in with them when I find them embarrassing, quite frankly. This kind of attitude and thought was caused by the colonial era. Oh wow, it's so Peranakan. So the Baba Nyonya people were singing Gong Si, Gong Si, Gong Si, Gong Si Ni, blah blah blah, ling long ding dong chong, until the evil white man came and brainwashed us with the English language. Is it your patronizing crowd? However, these Chinese people who lived in the materialistic world lacked a stable culture and ethical standards. Also, Baba Nyonya people are soulless unless they learn Chinese and become Chinese again. Even Malays had the Islamic tradition as their humanity and morality foundation. However, some Chinese who only received the English education only knew the value of money. Though they looked Chinese physically, however, culturally and spiritually, we could see they were neither Chinese, Englishmen, Indian, nor Malays. Maybe they did not understand who they really were.
Now look here, Chinaman. We did not lose touch with our Chinese culture. You condescending jit, you patronizing prick. Our ancestor cut ties with China because he was walking towards freedom. He was walking away from your rigid, cold, and hierarchical Confucian bureaucracy in order to build something new. And he did. You know what's funny? My African-American friend was telling me that some African nationalists tell him that he must get in touch with his African culture again, right? So he says to me, why on earth should I get in touch with the culture of the people who sold my people into slavery in the first place? Yeah, the very descendants of the fellows who sold him into slavery, his ancestors into slavery, are now telling him to get in touch with his culture. So it's ironic that the very descendants of the Mandarins who bullied my ancestor, who made it unbearable for the poor Chinese sailorman to live in China, now have the gall to tell his descendants that you must come back to our culture. Sorry, your ancestors made life unbearable for mine in China, that they had to leave for Nusantara for greener pastures, and they found freedom in Nusantara. So Chinamen, take your culture, take your identity, and take your language back with you. We do not want it. Now, if other Babas and Nyonyas decide to learn it as a hobby, yes. But it is not a yardstick of belonging in Southeast Asia. You chose to come to Southeast Asia, you conform to our tribe's rules. And by conforming to our tribe's rules, that also means respecting the boundaries between you and us, and not evangelizing about a culture that we cut ties with. You say that we look down on Chinese educated people and that we think highly of ourselves because we speak English. No, we did not choose English as our language because English made us high class. No, we chose English as the bridge language to unite the people of our community. So a Penang Baba, a Malacca Baba, and a Singapore Baba could all communicate with each other, even though their regional dialects varied, right? It wasn't because we wanted to be Englishmen, but because you're so trapped in that stupid false binary between Chinese educated or English educated, you can't seem to conceive that English was a neutral bridge language for all of us, because it did not belong to any community on this land. But Chinese in Southeast Asia, especially in a country like Singapore, is not neutral, because Chinese is basically institutional power. Like Pierre Peng, for example, the Singaporean actor, said, for example, that he had to learn Mandarin in school, and his survival depends on Mandarin. Now this is basically the language of a man in a hostage situation. Why should a man's survival, why should a man whose ancestors have been here for hundreds of years depend on the goodwill and depend on the approval of people whose ancestors got off a boat 4 generations ago, or even less perhaps, or even fewer perhaps? We are not your long-lost banana cousins. We are not part of your Chinese tree, and it is not your right to lecture and to chide us about losing touch with our roots, because our roots are here. Our roots were formed on the warm and fertile soil of Nusantara, not in the cold and miserable land of Beijing. Okay? And we intend to keep it that way. We do not want you to bring your Confucian hierarchies over here and to impose the Confucian hierarchies of the people who made life unbearable for my ancestor in China. Okay? Take this shithole hierarchy and bring it back to China and don't impose it here.
Indeed, Professor Wolfgang Frank drew his conclusion from people who were English educated in the 1950s and 1960s. The question is, does this problem hinge on time and regional differences of the people who had abandoned Chinese culture under English education? Well, I never abandoned Chinese culture because I never chose it in the first place. Okay? It was never my culture in the first place. As a matter of fact, not only English educated people during the times of Dr. Lim were like that. Even the younger generation of students in Singapore today under the so-called bilingual education are like that too. Does this sound familiar? At the beginning of the 20th century, after the 1980s, it was a fact that we could not dispute. The Chinese standard of Singaporeans became lower than before, along with the gradual closing of Chinese schools. Hey, Bangau! Malay is the national language of Singapore, not Chinese. Chinese is a foreign tongue that has nothing to do with the culture of Southeast Asia, okay? It's got nothing, absolutely nothing to do with whether you belong in Nusantara as a rooted Nusantaran or not, okay? However, a bigger problem that no one can understand is that Singaporean standard of English did not improve much while their Chinese standard went from bad to worse. Why do you think that Chinese is the national language of Southeast Asia? Why are you so fixated on Chinese when Singapore is a country in Southeast Asia? Actually, only about 40% of the students passed the O-level examination when they graduated from secondary school. For most people, if they give up their most familiar language, their mother tongue, and then seek another language in order to get to know their own traditional cultural values better, there seems to be few successful cases in the world. Dungu. Mother tongue means the language that you grew up speaking in the house, okay? If your language was English, it would be English. Do you understand? Race and culture are not the same thing. Culture is not something that is inherent in a person's DNA. It's such a simple bloody fact. What? Is it really hard to comprehend that if you raised someone from a Chinese family, you took a child from a Chinese family, you raised that child in an Indian family, and that Indian family spoke Tamil to that child, then their mother tongue would be Tamil, Dungu, not Mandarin or Hokkien or Hakka or Cantonese or Teochew or whatever. I honestly think these Chinese diaspora fanatics in Southeast Asia are really as dumb as a bag of bricks because, not only do they believe that Chinese is the national language of Malaysia to the extent that they believe that if you live in Malaysia, you must speak Chinese, and they call people who don't speak Chinese an embarrassment. Well, they also seem to think that your mother tongue is genetically linked to your DNA, as if there's such a thing as a Chinese race in the first place, a conception that didn't even exist until the 20th century. So these dungus, these blockheads, are the ones making policy right now. These blockheads who seem to confuse race and nation are the ones who are making policy and deciding who speaks what language. Yes, these Chinese diaspora blockheads who basically, don't have any conception of the simple idea of mother tongue, who can't even pass a simple bloody anthropology university course, are the ones who are making decisions in policy.
We are bilingual, Chinaman. We speak English. We speak Malay. Is Malay not a language to you? Can you count? Bilingual means fluent in 2 languages, right? Kami orang Baba dah 100 lebih tahun, 200, 300 lebih tahun fasih dan reti berbahasa Melayu. Sebagai orang luar yang tiada kaitan dengan budaya kami, ini bukan hal awak. Budaya kami bukanlah masalah awak. Dan seperti mereka cakap dalam negara barat, aku akan kata ini. Stay in your own lane. So allow me to make something very, very, very clear to you. The Baba or the Nyonya does not need fixing. The Baba or the Nyonya does not need correction if they choose not to speak Chinese. The Baba or the Nyonya does not need to return to some imagined Chinese diaspora identity. No. It's not your place to tell the Baba or the Nyonya that they have lost touch with their roots. You don't get to tell someone who has hundreds of years of rootedness in this country that they are a banana when you never even bothered planting roots in the first place. Okay? Now, let's talk about Lim Boon Keng and why Lim Boon Keng was another one of these Straits Chinese imposters who ended up taking the title of Baba. Now, I have to make something very clear. My hatred is not towards the Chinese diaspora. My great-grandfather passed away when he was young, okay? My great-grandmother married a Straits-born Chinese man, and he was the stepfather of my grandmother. But I love him. Even though I never met him, I love him as much as I love Mr. Goh, my great-grandfather, because he kept the identity of the Peranakan strong in our family. He never tried to correct them. He never tried to basically force Chinese identity or Chinese language or Chinese culture on them. And he was a good husband and a good man. So I don't regard him as an intruder. I regard him as very much a part of our family. But having said that, there were a lot of Straits Chinese, so-called Straits Chinese in the 19th century, posing as Babas in wolf's clothing, who were pretending to be Baba, but were in fact not. Like Lim Boon Keng, for example. Now, Lim Boon Keng's grandfather arrived in 1839. That's around the same time that many of the late arrivals arrived, right? Lim Ma Peng was just, he was literally a Sinke from China. And he married a Straits-born Chinese woman, and then suddenly 2 generations later, his grandson is calling himself a Baba because he was English educated, he wore a tailored suit, and he spoke fluent Malay. And now his grandson was calling himself a Baba, even though Lim Boon Keng himself personally believed that Malay blood was making the Chinese in Nusantara weak and degenerate. In fact, he believed that more Chinese blood would be good to solve this problem of degeneration in the tropics. And he also believed that, the Chinese in Nusantara must get back in touch with their Chinese identity. So this is clearly not a man who has any sense of rootedness in the land, but is merely a man who is still dreaming about China while living in Singapore. Okay? Now, look, it takes a while for the diaspora to acclimatize. Some of the diaspora never really acclimatize, and they eventually go back to the country their ancestors came from. That's fine. But don't call yourself something that you are not. If you are not Peranakan, please do not call yourself Peranakan just because you like some aspects of our culture. Lim Boon Keng liked sambal, of course. And he liked the kebaya. He made his sisters wear it, in fact. But that doesn't make him Peranakan. Because to be Peranakan means to regard Nusantara as your North Star, to regard the kampong as the birthplace of your civilization. Neither Lee Kuan Yew nor Lim Boon Keng embodied this ethos. Lee Kuan Yew did not see the kampong as something that was close to his heart. He saw it as a problem to be managed. He saw the village, the Malay village, as something that needed to be fixed and modernized. In the same way, Lim Boon Keng, did not like Malay influence in the Peranakan culture. In the same way, many modern Peranakans who have imbibed this mentality now say that, oh, we're just Chinese, we just adopted some aspects of Southeast Asian culture in order to survive here. But they don't talk about it with love in their heart. They don't talk about the Malay base of their culture with love in their hearts. And this is a very sad thing to me. So if you have to realize that I'm fighting against the misrepresentation and erasure of my own people in real time by people who claim to be one of us but are in fact not. So of course I can't relax, and I seem a little bit angry and uptight, but I'm really not trying to be cruel or mean. So I have to make it very clear that being Peranakan, or I should be more specific, being a Baba or a Nyonya, is more than just wearing the kebaya. It's more than a weekend hobby. It's more than just playing mamasak and liking Nyonya food or speaking beautiful Malay. To be a Baba or a Nyonya is a civilizational ethos. It's not a weekend hobby. It is the state of being culturally and spiritually rooted in this land of Nusantara. And if your mind is still orbiting China, if you believe that the only way you'll be happy is if you're Chinese again, if you Re-Sinicize, please do not call yourself Baba or Nyonya, because you are muddying the waters of our culture. So I just want to say thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day.